Okay, we are going to jump into a quick lesson on the clone stamp tool in Photoshop. So as you know, cloning is duplicating something. The clone stamp tool in Photoshop is right here. It's about the 8th or ninth one down. So this is called the clone stamp tool. And the idea of the clone stamp tool is when you click on a source. So let's say this was what I wanted to duplicate, this cute little puppy here. If I click on him, I get an error because it says to select the clone, I have to define it, and I have to hold down Alt and click to define my source point. So if I hold down Alt on my keyboard and I click on this puppy dog, he's now my source point. So when I let go of Alt and I go to a new area, as soon as I start drawing, it will duplicate, and you can actually see off to the right there what it's duplicating. There's a little crosshairs there, but it's duplicating that. Now, a few things about the clone stamp tool. So for example, I could, with this dog, if I wanted to, I could cover one of his legs with grass and make him look like he didn't have one of his legs. So right here, I'm just duplicating that grass over his leg. Okay, so that would be the clone stamp tool. Now, a couple points about the clone stamp tool that you might want to be aware of is, first of all, it's generally advantageous to have a soft round brush. So you want the hardness at 0. It'll blend a little bit nicer. Another thing is that you want to choose your source point somewhat frequently. So what I mean by that is the following, that if I click, let's say I wanted to cover up this cell phone. If I want to cover it up with the sand that would typically be under it, so here's my source point. If I start working, my source point was originally 1.5 inches roughly to the right. So if I continue to just use that same source point, it's actually just going to move that cell phone because that cell phone is just moving 1.5 inches to the left of where it used to be. So another important point about using the clone stamp tool is you frequently have to go back to your source point and just keep blending. So I'm going to click here, do a little bit of sand work. I'm going to click here, do a little bit more sand work, and then click. Now, my last point, this is going okay. Again, you want to spend more time on this. My last point is you want to use a generally decent sized clone stamp tool. So you'll remember that the keys beside the letter P on your keyboard make the brush smaller or larger. So if you used a tiny brush like this size, the problem is that you'd have to do a ton of painting, and it's also just not going to blend as well. So having a decent sized clone stamp tool is important. And I guess the last important thing is not to clone stamp things that are repetitive in nature. So you wouldn't want to clone stamp this right here, that seaweed, because what will happen, first of all, it's blurry in this case, but it looks like a duplicate. Like there's no way that that particular seaweed would be duplicated twice. So to use your clone stamp effectively, you want to clone an area that doesn't look like it would be unique in nature. Lastly, one of the applications of this is when my students sometimes get into an assignment called the Snowboarder magazine. We're going to select the original snowboarder. We're going to copy and paste him into a new layer. So I've got a second duplicate snowboarder that can be higher. You can then use the clone stamp tool on that background to get rid of the original snowboarder. So if I go to the clone stamp tool, if I'm on that background layer, I can then choose my source point, which would be the clouds here, to go over him. Now I'm going to have to rasterize. You might get a pop-up here where you have to rasterize. But the idea here is now I could clone over that original snowboarder with the wispy clouds that are behind him. Lastly, it's more difficult to clone on pure blue sky because of the slight gradient that's in the sky. So if I went to one like this, where I copied and pasted the original snowboarder and had a new snowboarder doing a flip or something like that, it would be more difficult in this case to clone over this snowboarder because of the slight gradient in the sky. You could try it and it would work out fine, but you're going to find that when the dark blue meets the light blue when you're cloning, you're going to have some inconsistencies. You're just going to want to be careful. So that's a clone stamp tool. That's how it's utilized, and that is all.